That was fancy music. Hi. Welcome. Hi, everyone. It's the Esther Keeps the Score book launch party. I'm throwing myself a party. Hi. First and foremost, thank you for coming to my party. If you're here, I already see some people in the comments saying hi. Hello. Thank you for being here. I find it really, really difficult to celebrate myself and the things that I've done. So thank you to each and every one of you for making this a little bit easier than it could have been. Hi. It's really exciting that this is actually happening. I've been thinking about this day for a long time. So hi. All that to say, let's get to the actual program of my party because planned fun. Tonight, I'd like to actually begin this time with a teeny tiny reading of my book just from my preface, and then I'll have a really short summary of the work that is found in my book. And then I'd love to introduce you, my three very special guests individually, obviously, who I've told they have as much or as little time as they want to do, whatever they want to do with that time. So they get to kind of do whatever. It has to just kind of be Esther related. And you will like it, and that's not a threat. Maybe. At the end, we will also have some time for Q&A if you have anything to ask from any of us here, but otherwise the party will be over and you'll get your party favor from our gracious hosts, which is not actually me. It is the publisher of this book and the real host of this party, which is SCM Press. And I hope that sounds okay with you, because if it isn't okay with you, that's really just bad news, because that is what we're going to do. You don't really have a choice. Sorry. Anyway, all said, it is now story time with Dr. Fry. Hello. I'm going to be reading from pages IX to XI from this book that does have the most gorgeous cover of all time. I'm sorry, I'm going to brag about it forever. You can judge the inside, but the outside is already prejudged by the Lord, and it's perfect. I don't know if I just committed a sin, probably. Anyway, for me, this really brief preface and this reading that I'm about to share with you kind of sums up my journey with Esther. And I think it sets up the posture for reading the whole book and kind of the tone that I had for interpreting the whole book. So, story time with Dr. Fry. There are no pictures, so forgive me. When my boss informed me that I would be spending my time researching the book of Esther as part of my new role, I internally responded with revulsion and recoiled, but not for the reasons one would think. First, I had some feelings about being the woman on our project relegated to a woman's book, as if, because I presented as very stereotypically feminine, I would want to study this book. There are, of course, many assumptions involved in that take, and Frederick, if you are reading this or hearing this, hi, Frederick, here is my heart. Thank you for also having me study Ezekiel, even though that's kind of a terrible book, to be fair. As I dutifully went about translating and studying, I realized there was another reason for my impulse to shy away. Ironically, one that is not commonly cited as the reason why the Book of Esther has been and is disliked. This book has repeatedly shown up in my life, time and time again. I grew up in a non-denominational church in the United States Midwest, where I was explicitly taught from an early age that I should never smoke, drink, dance, gamble, get tattoos, or have premarital sex. I now find it deeply ironic that in this same church, I also starred in a musical as the famous Esther. Esther features excessive drinking, gambling, and certainly premarital and generally excessive sex. No, the musical did not include these things. Esther Ordinary Faith was the name of the play. I remember my grandma, who was a hairdresser, applying a washable coat of dark brown to my blonde, highlighted hair for the show, as well as forgetting an entire line of my script. I also remember feeling incredibly lucky to play Esther. For a loud, neurodivergent girl in a church where she was told to bottle it up, although it was never an issue with Joel and Sharon Camenetti, who ran King's Kids and took my energy in stride, Esther was a comfort. She's a hero. She's so brave. I'm the star, not the problem. It did not help that one of my nicknames, my many nicknames, bestowed by my parents was Queen, sometimes shortened to just Q. Years later, during my stint as a teacher and administrator for women's programs in a complementarian megachurch, I put my Master of Divinity to good use as I prepped to teach on Esther in the autumn of 2018. It would be my last time teaching in such a setting, as I had given my 12-week notice, and that's not a joke, I gave them 12 weeks. I had faced serious spiritual and professional abuses, unable to use my gifts as they needed to be relegated to proper gendered places, but also unable to be myself. I was punished for speaking out about injustice, and I was also told I was not allowed to share with others why I was leaving. I was mourning this loss as I loved teaching. Having to create curriculum and teach a book of the Bible that made no mention of God meant I would focus wholeheartedly on the concept of providence. I was struggling with that myself personally. As I wrapped up teaching these texts, I would also receive my acceptance letter into the PhD program at the one school I had applied to. There's no wonder on my part as to why I was drawn to the concept of trauma hermeneutics for my dissertation and why I continue to see its value. I am no longer a Christian, at least in the traditional and social meanings of that term. This is not the space for these grievances. While I do argue in the book that presuppositions involving God in the Book of Esther are somewhat unhelpful, I find it jarring, be it even ironically providential, to be brought back to her. Although I was silently kicking and screaming, annoyed at best, I quickly saw Esther once again as I saw myself. This time I have much more compassion, accountability, clarity, and nuance. I'm not an academic who writes under the guise that I can ever remove myself from my work, so I find it best to lean into it while remaining curious. Similarly, in her memoir, the author Lydia Yuknovich attempts to parse the, quote, slippages that happen to women in the stories we tell about them or ourselves, end quote. An essential development in biblical studies is the practice of reflexively recognizing what of ourselves we impose on biblical characters in our interpretations and rereadings, filling gaps in narrative with what we hope and desire, while erasing those we might have previously proclaimed to be giving voice to. This book is best understood, then, as another, different version of Esther, one that should not replace the Masoretic text of Esther, but can exist alongside it, alongside her. I maintain my commitment to responsible biblical scholarship on these pages, which is why I'm adamant that my work be understood as informing but never replacing Esther. The slippages between myself and the characters in Esther have created a new kind of existence, one marked by the fluidity I have found in the biblical books spilling out, and I have been thrilled to be engulfed by it. Yuknovich writes, quote, "Aren't we always entering some storyline that existed before we were born and will continue long after we die?" End quote. As I've been saying, I have very much used this book as a way to process myself. Quote, "We forge ourselves through fiction," end quote. So what follows in Esther Keeps the Score is my love letter to the book of Esther and to the figure of Esther herself. There's my little reading. And just a short summary of my book as a whole from that lens that I hope kind of colors what follows. I'll just add briefly that the book then begins with an introduction to what is trauma hermeneutics. I use that fancy label, which is simply a label to describe reading a text with trauma in mind, as well as an introduction to the Masoretic text of Esther, which is the text I analyze in the book. And I do have to actually clarify that, because if you don't know, there are Greek versions of Esther. They're pretty interesting. Chapter 1 is a discussion on dynamics of migration and diaspora and introduces concepts like transgenerational and insidious trauma, as well as the social constructions of trauma. I mainly read Esther 1 through 4 in that chapter. Chapter 2 gets into the particular trauma response of the people pleaser or fawn type that I think Esther exhibits brilliantly. And that I actually cover quite a bit of text. So I read parts of Esther 2 through 9, actually 1 through 9. So the book. Chapter 3 of my book is really about Esther 8 through 9. And when we're in chapters 8 through 9, we're talking about wrestling with and refuting discussions on self-defense and just war. And then we get into things like the revenge fantasy and theories on collective victimhood. In here, I talk about warnings also involving the use of trauma theory, specifically in asking the really difficult moral questions about what happens when we only identify with the victims in a story, especially in a story that I believe shows what happens when the cycle of trauma continues on and might even be asking its readers to see that cycle and to stop it. Finally, I do conclude the book, and I will conclude my talking with really short notes on other characters that did not get enough attention in the book with this lens, because word counts do matter. And I'm really sorry, Rachel, that I did go over those word counts regardless of that. But I do try to pay a little bit of attention to characters like Vashti, the many other girls that are trafficked into the palace with Esther, the eunuchs, and King Ahasuerus. I argue that this reading and my reading, especially if I'm going to be trauma-informed girly pop over here, is all about offering choices and connection. And this book, I hope, is an invitation to interdependence and complexity in a world where the powerful are trying to continuously foreclose that. And thankfully, I'm not alone, I think, in that. There was literally a book on Esther and trauma that came out a month before this baby did by Camilla Hall Sharp. But even before this, I certainly utilized other scholars who already do this kind of trauma-inspired reading in crafting my own work, especially and including the Book of Esther, which leads me into a really easy introduction for our first guest here, Sarah Emanuel. Sarah is an associate professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University, and she does a lot of work at the intersection of humor and trauma. Her most recent monograph is Wrestling with Paul the Apostle, His Readers, and the Fate of the Jews, because yes, she is actually technically more of a New Testament scholar by trade, but I mean, multifaceted. Nevertheless, I mean, y'all can't really welcome with applause here, but please do welcome my fellow co-chair of the Trauma Hermeneutics Unit at SBL, Sarah, with me today. Hi.
Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I say good morning from Los Angeles, California. I recognize we're all in different time zones, but truly it's a joy to be here celebrating Alexiana's new book, Esther Keeps the Score. So my entryway into the Book of Esther began in childhood through the carnival celebration of Purim. Every year, I dress up as either a character from the Megillah or from broader public imaginations. Cinderella in rags was my favorite, don't ask, and attended my shul's Purim festivities. The bounce houses, cakewalks, and dunk rabbis were my favorite Purim games. Alongside Sukkot and Hanukkah, Purim was one of the holidays to which I look forward most. Of course, there is more to Esther than childlike fun. Abuse, violence, secrecy, and death run rampant throughout the narrative. As a child, it can be hard to conceptualize such literary tragedy. I remember learning about death, and I remember it terrifying me. Yet it wasn't until I became older that the nuances of life and loss became clearer. The nuances are still nuancing, so to speak, especially as I have become a new mother. I raise all this to say, I remember the painful facets of the tale, including especially Esther's precarious position and the fates of Haman and his children being revealed at Purim. Yet my young mind, paired with the surrounding glee of the holiday, made it difficult to comprehend the layered traumas of the story. My first article on Esther, Trauma and Counter-Trauma in the Book of Esther, Reading the Megillah in the Face of the Post-Shoah Sabra, was an attempt to tackle some of these layers, to name, for example, not only the collective trauma of Jews, a trauma, to be fair, I had inherited even in and through Purim celebrations, but also the various responses to that trauma within the Esther narrative, including the edict reversal at the end of the story. Still, I think much remains missing from that article, which has become all the more clear to me upon reading Alexiana's book. There are three aspects of Alexiana's monograph I want to highlight here today, although, of course, much more can be said of the multiple analyses running through her research. First, Alexiana adds depth to the why and how of the text's collective trauma with sensitivity to both the nuances of the text's historical textual realities and the theories she engages. On trauma theory, for example, Alexiana does not bifurcate the individual from the collective, the mind from the body, the effects of one traumatic experience from another, or necessarily even one theoretical entryway from another. Although careful to demarcate from whom and when and where a theoretical understanding emerges, she writes on trauma that, quote, "There's no simple detangling that can occur in the messy matter of trauma. Any discussion on trauma that attempts to stay solely in one place or theory tends to be self-defeating. All we can do is be as clear as possible within the mess and seemingly disparate approaches to produce a more nuanced version of traumatic totality, one that begins to account for individual psychology and collective histories," end quote. This carries over into Alexiana's work on migration, seeing it as itself multi-layered and, in some cases, including the case of Esther, traumatic. She shows that diaspora is not merely the backdrop against which the plot unfolds, but rather a chosen trauma through which the Esther author crafts his narrative. In Alexiana's view, the text bears witness to both historical-induced trauma, e.g. exile, and insidious trauma, e.g. repeated cultural otherness in diaspora, which are then expressed as transgenerational compounded traumas throughout the Megillah. Living under the thumb of Persian rule, she writes, is an unsettling and indeed unsettled situation, one that, quote, demands a kind of performance, even a hypervigilance. One wonders, she adds, if the seeming threat of falling outside the lines of Persia's porous boundaries may have been just stressful enough to reactivate and inflame a past trauma, end quote. This is indeed where Alexiana's work becomes so helpful. She showcases when, why, and how Esther is a text that consistently performs chosen trauma, migrant anxiety, and the compounded effects therein. Careful to not flatten such expressions, for Alexiana also makes note of character differences with regards to power, place, and gender. Reflective of the variety of human experience, trauma, she shows, is neither felt nor expressed the same from one character to the next. A question I find myself asking lately concerns how we can distinguish trauma as chosen when so much about trauma has to do with its inescapable grip upon its targets without remorse or consent. The effects of trauma, at least on the individual level, is often described as not a choice. How then do we negotiate this when it comes to narrations of collective betrayal? Alexiana's work on character difference leads me to my second highlight, which is her recognition that much of the current work on Esther and trauma does indeed focus on the collective, without much attention to these deeper nuances. While Alexiana does not negate the import of collective trauma or exclude it from her own study, as demonstrated in the summary on trauma and diaspora just told, she also provides a reading of specific characters, perhaps most notably Esther. In Alexiana's view, Esther is a femme extraordinaire, a character who is hypervigilant to the needs of those around her, yet shut down to her own. This is a common response to trauma, she makes clear, especially by bodies made minoritized, such as post-exilic Jewish women living under a non-Jewish patriarchal system. Alexiana then shows how this is enacted in the text. Esther, for example, is consistently tov, or pleasing, to not only the king, but also to Mordechai. Quote, her internal radar to her needs has been conditioned to completely shut off in order to become hypervigilant to others' needs, especially those who are supposed to care for and meet her needs and have failed to, end quote. Even Esther's request to add an additional day of slaughter in Esther 9:13 might be to please King Ahasuerus's own interests. In Alexiana's words, Esther knows that the king, quote, is not opposed to genocide or violence more generally as a way to govern. And so she thus may, come chapter 9, be thinking to herself, What would be best to please the king at this time after one day of war? Perhaps more gratuitous death? End quote. At the same time, Alexiana makes clear that we can't really know the reasoning behind Esther's request. The truth of the matter remains that, by the story's end, we do not really know Esther at all. We see no development of her internal sense of self, just consistent hyper-awareness upon those around her. She is, as the text reminds us, hidden. I'll say here that I do not think interpretations of Esther moving forward can exclude Alexiana's interpretation of Esther in this book. It is the kind of analysis that, in my view at least, must be engaged by those in the field moving forward. Alexiana also notes that as much as Esther may seem, and this is my third point, may seem different from other Jewish texts due to its internal instabilities and lack of contemporaneous Jewish markers, e.g. God, this is all assuming the very limited amount of sources to which we have access to demonstrate a concept of ancient Jewish norm. She writes that, quote, we must move away from essentialism, including the essentializing of Jews in antiquity, Jews in the story, and Jews in the story's afterlives. As she so elegantly puts it, quote, the desire to categorize Esther and thus make it more unstable pigeonholes the inherent hybridity that the book might be all about, end quote. Alexiana also notes, though, and as she read for us today, that as much as we may hope to be historically nuanced in our readings, our personal paths and presence do shape how we read. This indeed gets me back to how I opened my response. My first entryway into the book of Esther is a Jewish one. The field of biblical studies, however, at least in my view, and despite its traditional commitment to ostensible objectivity, has been shaped by Christian sensibilities. I question, in fact, if the perspective that she discusses of Esther not fitting is itself part of such Christian sensibilities. And I don't think Alexiana is leaning into this. I'm just talking about the sort of the history of interpretation she discusses about Esther not fitting traditional Jewishness. I'm wondering if that history itself or that history of interpretation itself might be part of the field's Christian sensibilities. So to put it otherwise, what if it is precisely the text's lack of stability, including its lack of godness, that is an essential part of its Jewishness? I, of course, recognize the possible Jewish anachronism in this too. Yet I still think it is worth noting that much of Jewishness's stability is indeed its lack of stability, its continuous escaping of boundaries, as evidenced already through the Tanakh's own contradictory and polyvocal points of view. Women's studies scholar Evelyn Torton-Beck has argued something similar with regards to the invisibility of Jews and Jewishness in intersectional feminist work. She writes, quote, I believe that a significant portion of the problem stems from our initial conceptual framework, which established and quickly fixed the interlocking factors of sex, race, and class as the basis for the oppression of women. While such a framework has allowed us to stretch sex into sexual difference and race into ethnicity, it failed to allow us to account for the Jew, who cannot be made to fit into the pre-existing categories. Jew describes a variety of factors, including, but not limited to, the intersection of religious identification, historical, cultural, ethical, moral, and linguistic affinities, end quote. Maybe, in this way, Esther's inability to be pinned down makes it one of the most Jewish texts of all. I want to end by saying that Alexiana's book has offered us a model for interdisciplinary thinking. She not only explains clearly her theoretical entryways, but also her applications of them, leaving readers better equipped to engage biblical studies, trauma studies, and migration studies. But in addition to these more traditional academic offerings, she also leaves readers with the difficult knowing that, even as a book of fantasy, Esther, like all fantasy, does things. The Megillah moves and has moved persons of a variety of persuasions, including Jewish, anti-Jewish, and Jewish supremacist, to do things in their own worlds. She reminds us that we are not merely passive readers, but readers with agency. Something Alexiana encourages us to do is recognize that Esther is not a straightforward story. It is messy, it is porous, it is comical, it is painful. It has been used to vilify Jews, and it has been used by Jews to vilify non-Jews. Like trauma, Esther and its afterlives cannot be contained, nor Alexiana urges should there be. Congratulations, Alexiana. My thrill for you also cannot be contained. I'm so glad to be here and so happy to be part of this conversation. Mazal tov.
Thank you, Sarah. That's beyond generous. And thank you so much for entering into this conversation in a similar way that I did. Thank you. Also, I wrote this down immediately. The word chosen trauma, I think it's just terrible. Like, it's also created by Vamek Volkan, who's a psychoanalyst, who doesn't say that it's chosen. Like, so why are you calling it chosen trauma? It gives the impression that this is like, yeah, I'm picking this. Like, that's just not how this works. Anyway, I'm sorry. Rant over. Thank you, Sarah, so much for all of it. Thank you. I would bring up the fact that I entered into our little room before this very upset because Esther is currently being referenced by Franklin Graham and then Tucker Carlson in the opposite direction. And so you're right. Esther continues to be used and abused and in the most anti-Semitic and abhorrent ways. It's yeah. Nothing you're surprised by, or myself, even though it just makes me so angry. Anyway, thank you, Sarah. Thank you. We're gonna do a hard left from here. Given, and it does work. Sarah opened with her own personal story, and I opened both this event and clearly my book with my own personal interactions with Esther. And I've actually said that I feel like Esther Keeps the Score is a tiny bit of my own kind of fanfic reading of Esther while using the tools of a trade as a biblical scholar. On that note, I kind of want to introduce somebody that I think does that extremely well, which is Esther Brown-Smith. Esther Brown-Smith is assistant professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Dayton. She's the author of many articles on Esther, including a favorite of mine that views Esther as a kind of fanfic itself, and also does another fantastic piece on Esther in the recent volume Trans-Biblical. However, as an aside, she's the author of one of my most favorite academic books, Gendered Violence in Biblical Narrative, The Devouring Metaphor. It's so delicious, might I say. When I was writing her review on that, I was told maybe that wasn't, shouldn't maybe use that link, but here it is. All which to say, please welcome my friend, a different Queen Esther, with me today.
Thank you so much, Alexiana. So I was just so honored to have the chance to read this incredible book before its release. Alexiana has crafted a monograph that is timely, it's incisive, and it is very deeply rooted in both critical scholarship and in human empathy. When she invited us to be creative with our contributions for this book launch, I decided to focus on her striking insights about the character of the character Esther as shaped by complex PTSD and the fawn trauma response. Now, my own academic work on the Book of Esther rereads it as transformative fiction, or fanfic, as Alexiana puts it. So because I do believe in the power of fiction to communicate ideas, I want to share with you a short story about Esther's experiences through that lens of trauma that Alexiana communicates. So if her book is another version of Esther, then this is another version. Fawn. A not man is cradling Esther's hand, the odor of his breath masked by sickly sweet chewed fennel seeds. He presses his soft fingers into her palm, humming quietly at what he observes. Pliant, he says to himself. Smooth, good. Then he looks up at her face, his kohl-lined eyes calculating. I am Hegai. All the women in this complex are under my care. You will submit to our treatments for a year before you are worthy to bring before the king. Have your monthly courses started? She flushes, but Mordecai had warned her that the palace would ask these questions of her. So instead of protesting, she nods, eyes cast down. Yes, 2 years ago. Good. Some of our treatments may affect them. Don't be alarmed. After all, we don't want the harem filled with little brats. He chuckles at his own joke, sending a cloud of fennel breath in her face, then steps back and rakes his gaze over her body. Haggai nods in final approval. You'll go far. Keep your mouth shut, do as you're told, steer clear of the guards, and don't trust the other girls. If you need anything, you come to me, understood? Yes, she says. She understands. He may be a eunuch, but she's familiar enough with the look in his eyes. And is there anything else I can do for you, my lord? His smile widens. I knew I liked you. It's like you read my mind. Esther obeys Haggai's instructions as best as she can, but she can't bring herself to keep distance from the other girls. By the end of the first week, she befriends another girl from Susa, one of the first to be brought to the palace after the king's decree. The girl's name is Pantea, and as the months pass, she tells Esther all about the warrior general for whom she was named. Stories were all that the girls were allowed to bring with them, so they become currency. As the only Jewish girl in the harem, Esther would have been at an advantage, if it wouldn't have upset Mordecai quite so much for her to let the information spill out. She doesn't quite understand why it's so important to him. The girls here come from every corner of the empire, every tongue, every religion. But Mordecai has done so much for her, guided her so attentively. Of course she'll keep his secrets. Of course she'll obey him. She always has. Pantea has tawny hair that captures glints of the lamplight, framing broad lips that smile teasingly at the least provocation. One evening, as Esther twists her curls into a careful knot for sleeping, she catches Pantea watching her hands. When Esther has secured her locks in a silken wrap, she turns to Pantea. I can teach you how if you like. Caught staring, Pantea blushes. I don't have anything but stories to offer in return. You're always so much more put together than me. Esther bites her lower lip. I don't mind showing you. Seeing no further objection, she steps behind Pantea and gathers her lush hair into her hands. The weight of it is surprisingly heavy. The vulnerable proximity of Pantea's neck surprisingly distracting. Nevertheless, Esther divides the hair into neat portions, twisting and braiding them to preserve their natural wave. She talks as she does so, idle chatter about the foods they miss, the changeovers and guards, the oppressive heat of this season. When Esther finishes, she wraps Pantea's hair in a spare kerchief. Pantea's eyes widen. Oh, I couldn't possibly take that. It's got such pretty embroidery. Feeling an odd squirming of guilt in her stomach, Esther shrugs. It's fine. Haggai gave me extra fabric this month. Ah, Pantea says knowingly. Then she glances around for eavesdroppers and lowers her voice. Honestly, I don't know how you can stand his attention. His hands always feel oily, and I know he likes to watch the girls getting rubbed with their salves. She gives a dramatic shudder. Esther's stomach feels even more knotted now. She knows that Haggai is not a good man. All the favors he bestows have a price. But she also knows how much it eats away at him to know that he'll never father a son, never marry a woman, never even grow a man's beard. She's seen the frustration devouring him behind his smiles and generosity. She's felt that frustration in the tight grip of his fingers in her hair. His path is a hard one, and mocking him feels wrong somehow. So she keeps her voice light. He's not so bad, though. He really seems to want each of us to develop to our full potential. He only gets upset when he knows you could do better. Pantea rolls her eyes. How very kind of him. Then she lets out a loud and graceless yawn. It's getting late. Tomorrow I'll tell you the story my mama told me about a second son who met a talking horse. I haven't told it to anyone else here. Thank you, Esther says, biting her tongue so she doesn't mention her own story about a prophet and a talking donkey. The other girls make fun of her sometimes for her reticence, but that's all right. It's not their favor that she's here to win. Ahasuerus, the night that Esther finally meets him, looks younger than she'd imagined. He wears a loose dressing robe and sprawls in a chair, removing encrustations of ornate rings from his fingers. His cheeks are flushed, whether from intoxication or the lively fireplace, and he takes his time before looking up. When the servant closes the door, leaving Esther alone with him, she tries to remember all Haggai's advice. You'll want to be flawless, the perfect seductress. Don't bother. He's got enough trained girls and boys for that already. Your gift, your secret weapon, will be your vulnerability. You need to be someone he thinks he can mold into the queen of his imagination. So let him see that frisson of fear behind your bravery, real fear, not play acting, and he'll eat you right up. Ahasuerus looks up, and the silence hangs between them like a taut thread. The thought of his hands clutching at her flesh is anything but appealing, but she lets him see her gazing at them, tracing a line up to his broad shoulders and oiled beard. Be present, she tells herself. Don't let yourself hide from this. At last she speaks, her voice betraying a tremble. How may I please the king tonight? His gaze is still evaluating her, but he smiles with a flash of teeth. First, you can sit and drink some wine. You look like you're about to be executed, and I would never let that happen to a girl as pretty as you. He pats a wooden chair beside his own. Come here, little fawn, and relax. He does not ask her real name. Esther sits where he directs and sips a mouthful of heady spiced wine. The king watches her drink, then lifts his palm to her face and drags one thumb across her lips. You've got a lovely mouth, little fawn. I wonder what you know how to do with it. He chuckles at his vulgarity. Esther inhales, swiftly calculating what she could say that would be both the truth and a desirable response. I know less than many, she says at last, crafting each word with care, but I would be honored for you to teach me whatever I lack. She knows by the covetous flare in his eyes that she's spoken rightly. When his hand drifts down to stroke her collarbone, the flinch is easy to breathe away and conceal as a tremor of anticipation. After all, she's done all this before. Alexiana, thank you for the inspiration and congratulations. Back at you.
Thank you, Esther. That was, it was terrible, but thank you for making that come to life. Also awful, but thank you. That was really, really powerful. I appreciate that. Well, on another hard left. Last but not least. Last but not least. Whew. Feel like I need to okay. This is to be expected when you write a book on trauma. So, party is maybe a hard word for the book today. Anyway, last but not least, I need to introduce another phenomenal scholar, Catherine Gwyther. Catherine literally wrote the chapter on Esther for the forthcoming volumes on the Bible and violence. She has also written an article that I adored on fasting, feasting, and hybridity in the book of Esther, as well as an article on Mordecai and drag that I have stolen ideas with consent from an actual footnote. I'm also proud to say that I got to be with Catherine when she tried Taco Bell in the United States for the first time, which is a really important detail for our time today, obviously. All of which to say, please join me in welcoming Catherine.
Thank you so much, Alexiana. Just on that Taco Bell experience, I feel like I want to share with the audience that I remember this is at SBL maybe 4 years ago. I remember waking up the next morning to that Baja Blast neon yellow, blue, turquoise kind of color and just being a bit traumatized from it. So what a great place to start. But I can't believe I have to follow Esther in what is sort of a phenomenal story. I'm absolutely going to bug you after this for a copy of that. If anything, just to read again and properly soak in. Thank you so much for inviting me here to have this conversation. Esther is, well, the Book of Esther, I should say, is a bit of a hobby horse for me. I am not what I would call a biblical scholar that is an Esther scholar. My PhD is in Exodus. I was very much set on the Torah, ancient Near Eastern law pipeline, but Esther came about through my master's when I sort of read it for the first time. And I want to speak like Sarah and Alexiana have done, and Alexiana, in your book, obviously, you've spoken about your personal relationship to Esther. And I think that my approach to the Book of Esther and studying the Book of Esther doesn't exist in isolation from how I felt approaching it as sort of a woman biblical scholar. I'm particularly a woman biblical scholar whose main scholarship was on what is quite an openly male-dominated field. So Exodus, Torah, and ancient Near Eastern law. I was really taken when in your preface you took time and at length to discuss how approaching Esther from sort of a more faith context is complicated and a bit insidious, I hope is the term I want to use. I actually felt the same, this kind of uncomfortableness, this unsettlingness. I don't want to work with that book because traditionally that book has been described as women's work. It is where women are acceptable and accepted as researchers. And that's something that I definitely felt. And of course, that obviously didn't exist in isolation. And it was compounded by sort of this own experience as being a young woman within Hebrew Bible scholarship. Again, where my primary field was ancient Near Eastern law. But once I got my teeth into the book, I realized that this was sort of anything but women's work. Nothing was as innocent as it seemed. And despite sort of this overarching narrative within scholarship that Esther is this massive heroine, she goes and saves the Jews from the nasty Persians, there is actually a bit more once you scratch the surface. So I went into the Book of Esther sort of quite naively. I don't come from a faith background. I actually started a journey into biblical scholarship with quite poor biblical literacy comparative to everyone around me. But I think that helped when I first approached Esther. I didn't have any sort of these preconceived notions of what the text was meant to be. And instead, when I first encountered it, I wasn't quite convinced by this sort of narrative that the big bad enemy, the Persians, had been defeated and that the Jews were victorious and vindicated. Instead, I remember being taken aback, and I still remember now being sat in my friend's spare room, reading through articles on Esther, trying to come up with this sort of argument, what I wanted to say about Esther, and being struck by, oh my God, there aren't these separate categories or distinct categories. They all start to merge and blur together. And this fluidity and the way that power moves from person to person, from group to group, and when nothing is static, is how I would summarize Esther in my eyes. And I think, Alexiana, you pull this out so nicely in Esther Keeps the Score, where you talk about trauma, and trauma in the Book of Esther is never presented as static, as singular, but rather there's this plural experience that's constantly shifting from person to person, from group to group. And I think I want to sort of summarize here that Esther for me is a book that is about power plays and how it plays with power. That power in Esther is not given, or even if it is given, it's not sort of, it's not always static. It moves from group to group, although it presents sort of a homogenous face of power. It moves from group to group and it blurs together. It changes hands. It sort of criticizes hegemonic power. At the same time, it endorses it and it wants to be like it. And all of this to say, I'm getting confused on my words, is because power in the Book of Esther can be confusing. And that is how I approach the research and how I saw the Book of Esther. And I think the way I've spoken about Esther in my research, I hope does justice to that. So I wanted to briefly, I'll just take 2 minutes now to just sort of discuss where I approach Esther from and a bit of summary of my research. And then I'm going to bug Alexiana for more conversations about what she sees as the future of Esther research. Because when I was reading Esther Keeps the Score, I was taken aback. I wish I could show you my notebooks of just comments of, okay, I can use this, where can I use this in the future? This links nicely to this project. It's such a breath of fresh air in Esther scholarship, and I'm so thankful for that. So selfishly, back to my research, I first started exploring sort of Esther through this article on feasting and fasting, where I see Purim as this sort of joining together of Jewish and Persian identity in a way that destabilizes Persian hegemonic power and authority in the text. I think that Esther, especially, the character, plays with authoritative power and often speaks with the language of the oppressor in her own mouth. I then worked with my wonderful friend and colleague, Jo Henderson Marigold, who I could not mention when talking about our work on drag. I knew nothing about the scholarship. She introduced so much to me. I'm so thankful for that. But that article talked about how Esther, the Book of Esther, holds up the Persian court and brings its assumed authority into question, and how sort of Esther, Mordecai's appearance in Esther 8:15 is sort of a direct reference and presentation of the fortress of the Persian Empire in Esther 1:6. And it's not about just sort of mimicking or imitating the Persian Empire, but rather bringing that institution into question, that masculinity, the status of the ethnic other and Persian hegemony into question. And I think on paper, these two, they might exist, as we say, at separate SBL panels in separate journals. But actually, I think the common thread here is that Esther is a text that destabilizes these assumed ideologies and plays with the fluidity of power. Esther, and to kind of go back to Alexiana's work, Esther isn't settled. Esther, the character, the book, it is constantly moving interpretations. Every time I go back to the book, I see a new interpretation. I think that plural interpretations of the book are correct. I think that the more interpretations we have of this text, the better we can understand it, because it is not a book that presents one image, but one that is constantly moving. Alexiana, thank you so much for writing this. I have an eye in mind for a future project on masculinity in the Book of Esther, and I cannot wait to dive into that fully with this book in hand. And when I was thinking about how to sort of end this, I actually wanted to throw the ring back to you. I wanted to hear more about, what do you think your future with Esther looks like? Are you done? Do you want to say more? So yeah, Alexiana, I want to throw it back to you now, and sort of, where do you see Esther going in your future?
Thank you for that question. I am extremely ADHD. So part of what I thought would happen was that I would just hop onto the next thing. Like, I'd find something new and shiny and different. And I was actually also hoping that would happen because I do have other things that I need to write. And I've been really caught in Esther's excess, and I'm going to use excess. Sarah has used that term quite often in her own work with Esther and our work on trauma, and so excess, I think, is a really good word to talk about Esther. One of the things that really is on the forefront of my mind in still staying with Esther and my future work with Esther is expanding that research on diaspora specifically and Esther. Amongst us biblical scholars, I know we know, diaspora as a genre, or this is a diaspora story, or this is a court tale, as I was talking with a friend today. Jillian, you're on here. Hello. We're all saying different things when we say that. And it's really incredibly unhelpful when we don't actually have, not that I'm never of the mindset that I want to create a set definition for something that like solidifies a category or a genre. But I think it's really interesting when you're discussing, and I think we've all kind of mentioned this today when we've talked about Esther. Esther cannot be contained. She does what she wants. And I love that so much about her. And I do think that that is the point. I do think that is the point. And I think when we think about diaspora as something that is multiplicitous, that people themselves are also trying to define, and then as soon as they define it, it doesn't actually work. It does so much. I think I'm working on something right now that kind of reconfigures how we talk about that when we talk about that in biblical studies. That is, again, interdisciplinary, because I can't help myself. I think maybe that is the shiny thing for me, is that I keep looking at other fields. So specifically, that is a lot of what I'm working on right now with Esther, is trying to reconfigure how biblical scholars approach diaspora texts, right? I just think it's so pigeonholed and problematic. I would say problematic. So, yeah. But otherwise, I do feel like I have a little bit of a rut happening right now, in which I did the big thing, the project happened, and now so I am hoping that as I continue to work through some of these things, as I finish up projects, ironically, there's a fanfic writing of Esther called The Book of V, and I'm doing a little project on that right now. It's super, super good, super, super fun. Well, actually, it's not fun. It's really, really terrible, in the same way that Esther as a book is kind of terrible, which is why I love her. So all of which to say, I don't have it figured out, and I'm starting with diaspora. But thank you for that question. And thank you so much, Catherine, for being here. You're not out of place. I'm so glad you're here. I do find it ironic that you were talking about being a biblical scholar and Esther kind of being like, that's where the women scholars go. And it's all of us with our she, her. Yes. Oops. And maybe, yes, I did that intentionally. I don't care. Anyway, thank you, first and foremost, to everybody who's here. I'm super deeply uncomfortable with praise, but I'm just thrilled that you all had as much fun reading it as I had writing it. Thank you. Thank you. With that said, I do want to open it up to anyone who might have questions in the audience before we close up this kind of awkward party. And if no one has questions, we can also awkwardly end this without comment, and that's totally fine by me.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Yes.
Can I ask a question rather than walk into like talking about myself or on my own? And Esther Brownsmith, not Esther the character. This was very confusing to sort of frame in my mind. I have so many questions for you, and I think I will probably send you an email that is separate from this. And Alexiana and Sarah, I also would love to hear your thoughts on this, because Sarah, your comment about Esther not fit into institutional ideas of Jewishness, because those ideas have been shaped by Christians, is really powerful for me, especially as someone who in their professional life now teaches about Judaism, and it's often teaching about Christianity, and the history of Christianity, not Judaism itself. I actually wanted to ask about sort of the categories of Jewishness and masculinity, there's a quote, Alexiana, that you had of if to be feminine is to be disempowered. And I think that can stay for both. It's on page 57 if anyone is feeling particularly eager. But I think that works for both Jewishness and femininity in the book. But it strikes me that all of the characters at different times fit that category. So I think the broader question I want to ask is, are categories like masculine, feminine, Jewish, Persian particularly helpful when we read the text? And what do we do about it in a field of scholarship where we love objectivity and categories and definitions? How do we, and they're useful, right, for organizing ideas and for organizing thoughts. How do we deal with that sort of rejection of categories by the book itself?
Esther, do you want to tackle the gender conversation?
I mean, the first thing that it made me think of is that when I read that same thing in Alexiana's book, I thought about this, and then you brought it up again, that one of the kind of nuts I've literally been spending years trying to crack around the Book of Esther read as fan fiction is that modern fan fiction is by and large a very predominantly female phenomenon, something that is almost entirely women and non-binary people. And so I've been thinking, and so I kept running up into, well, okay, but most ancient scribes were male. It's probably best to assume the author of Esther is male. So how do you connect those things? And the way that I am leaning towards connecting them is in exactly the way of thinking less about specific categories and more about marginalization, minoritization, ways that different groups can be in a disempowered situation and respond in resistant ways to that disempowered situation. So yeah, I think that you're asking really good questions. I think there are parallels there, even as there are obviously very different. I'm not trying to say being female is the same as being Jewish in any way, not what I'm saying. But I think that when we're talking about modes of writing and modes of reacting in a literary way to pre-existing literature, I think that that lens of marginalization and resistance can be helpful. And back to you, Alexiana.
I don't know if, Sarah, you have any comment on this, but I mean, my whole shtick in the book is that all of these lines between these categories are so, and you repeated it, right? They're so incredibly blurry. And identities and like these hard and fast things like male, female, Jewish, Persian, what is X, Y, Z, they get really fuzzy. I think you're right. They are helpful as long as we don't hold on to them too tightly. In the same way, well, gosh, this is so hard to talk about because I do think that the book is saying it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think in the same way that we would say, okay, what is a sandwich? Well, a sandwich is something in between two loaves of bread. Well, then is a hot dog a sandwich because technically, or a hoagie, because technically it's just one piece of bread cut in half. So so it's this, the label or the category is only helpful to an extent, but I think what's interesting about how we're talking about the Book of Esther is it reaches its limit very quickly. It's helpful and then it's not. And having to be fluid along with those changing things is, I think it's not very fun for us folks who like things to be clear. Please.
I just wanted to add a word that has not, I think, been mentioned so far, but I think is a really important word for the Book of Esther, which is queer. I see Esther as a deeply, deeply queer book, not just in the sense of character sexualities, but in exactly what you're describing. The fact that, like queerness, it looks at pre-existing categories, things people think are, oh, well, that's just the way things are, that's the social norm. And it says, but what if it weren't? And so it does that in so many different ways, including but not limited to sexuality and gender.
I'll add too, and I'm feeling a bit unstable myself right now because my newborn has just woken up from a nap and she is screaming in the other room, which is not normal for her. So I am like half here, half there. But this evocation of queerness, of sort of like all of these destabilizations sort of relate in a way to these broader strokes of queerness, at least from an affective state and in a modern state. And I guess to the point that I tried to raise in my response, it also feels in these broader strokes Jewish. And I know that we're also deconstructing categories such as Jewish Persian, but even in all of these destabilizations, that too, I have this sort of like affective feeling of, oh, that is what it feels like to be Jewish. And so I'm not sure what to do with that. I'm not sure how much we could put that onto an ancient text, but I see a deep commonality between that queer destabilization and the sort of experience of Jewishness and destabilization.
Here for it. Very much here for it. I will say, because I did promise y'all that we would finish at the hour, and we are 2 minutes over, and that is deeply uncomfortable for me because I like to be in my times. However, there are a few questions that have come up. Sarah, I will say, if you need to go, go. I like.
Grab her. I'm gonna grab her. I'll be right back.
I'm here for that. Here for that. But I'm happy to answer a few questions, even if folks do need to run. Very happy to do so. So if we want to pump those babies up, let's do it. I don't know how to do it. There we go. Hi, Asia. Rosie is an incredible human being. I have been pestering her on when she was actually going to publish her dissertation because I am very much of the mindset that citations are political, and I like to make sure that good people are cited in my work as much as I possibly can. So I begged Rosie to send me her work, and she said, much to her chagrin, it was not perfect enough at that time to send it to me, which is tragic because I think it's perfect enough. But you say it's forthcoming publication. Now I'm going to have to bother Rosie again. Did I also pick up on humor? And if so, how did that inform your reading of trauma in the text? Absolutely, I picked up on humor. It's, I think I cited a couple times even in the book because a lot of folks read Esther as a comedy. That is a very common thing to do. And it is deeply outlandish. It is ridiculous. Things are exaggerated. It's a silly book. Even chapter 1 with the scene with Vashti is so deeply ridiculous that I think it causes us in the same moment where we have a really terrible man that was elected as president in the United States. We sit there and it's laughable at times because we're like, what could he, but it's also deeply lethal, right? So it's this double-edged sword of it is ridiculous, but people are dying, Kim. Sorry, I'm very deeply online, so I probably shouldn't have made a Kim Kardashian reference here. All of which to say, there is actually a fascinating conversation that I also have about the revenge fantasy. And TLDR, revenge fantasies are often not helpful to somebody who's suffering, even though they're also incredibly common. They're not helpful. However, in the same book where it was discussed that revenge fantasies aren't helpful, it's also discussed that there was a group of women who were sharing revenge fantasies with one another in like a group therapy setting. And when they started to share their revenge fantasy with someone else, they all started to giggle because they were that ridiculous, right? And because they were sharing that revenge fantasy with one another and they started to laugh, it like took the power of the revenge fantasy away and allowed it to be like shared. And there's something about that, especially when we talk about Purim. Like, this is ridiculous and we're sharing it with one another. It almost takes the sting away. So very much so, I think like many things in the book, including how we're talking about identity, it's a both and in a kind of way. It's very fluid. It's a both and. It depends on whose hands it's in, right? So actually, I think also Sarah, when she, and I'm probably just stealing this from her right now, but Sarah, when she teaches on the book of Esther, she shared one time that she opened up class by allowing them to play, what is that really ridiculous game? It's like something combat. I don't know if she's back, but it's
Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat. Okay, you're back. Because it's like gratuitous and ridiculous and silly. And it is kind of very similar to that point that we're trying to make here. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to jump on that, because you are the humor and trauma girl here.
Yeah, I think it all, on the topic of Esther, is so destabilizing and so disorienting and can go in so many different directions. The way my classes tend to read Esther shift from class to class. It depends on who is there. And sometimes my classes sort of collectively go the humor route. And sometimes my classes go collectively this cannot be humorous in any way, shape, or form. They think more along the lines of, Esther Brown-Smith's beautiful, evocative, terrible sort of imagining of what Esther as character may have been experiencing between the lines. And so as a way to bridge the two, I have had students play Mortal Kombat. I'll have IT come to the class and I'll set it up on the huge projector screen and students will just play for 30 minutes. And it's so gruesome and disgusting. And always they start laughing. And so it's just a way to bridge the two together and to get those classes to think about the intricacies and spaces between both extremes, like humor, fun, funny, and humor, grotesque, humor, traumatic, trauma without humor, etc.
I don't think we would be biblical scholars unless we said it's complicated. Okay. Kersey, I once heard a theory. Are you talking about, yeah, I've talked about this, that some of the families whose girls got trafficked would have actually wanted them to be chosen to advance the family's own social status. So no trauma involved. Thoughts? Well, I'd question the no trauma involved. Like, it depends on who you're talking about. And I think that is the challenge of even the reading that I offer, right? I can say, yes, Esther, I think compulsively fawns. And I do think that is a really powerful way to read it. But I don't get to sit, one, I'm not a clinician. But two, I also don't get to sit in a chair next to Esther and ask, hey, I'm reading it in this way. Is that what you're experiencing? Like maybe my therapist would in a room with me. So it's a lot of the reading that I even do is fairly hypothetical, even though I try really hard. I think it's complicated. There are some of those families whose maybe they were hoping. I don't know if that necessarily means that trauma wasn't involved, but certainly whether or not something is traumatic has everything to do with context. It has everything to do with resourcing. It's complicated. So I would say maybe. Cool. Glad we figured that one out.
Can It's Complicated be the tagline just for this?
Yeah, I
like-
think Esther Keeps the Score. It's complicated.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. I don't know if there were any other questions or if we're all set. I do see Sophia's question earlier. It says, who is the audience for the book, students, scholars, etc.? Yes. I would say yes. My goal with this book specifically was, I imagined if an academic book, like a traditional academic book and a trade book, if they had a baby, that it would be this. So it is definitely more academic leaning and a little bit more difficult to read, but it is not fully academic reading. I think it is a lot more prosaic. I can't help myself. That's kind of how I write more generally. So the audience for the book is whomever wants to try it, honestly. I do think that is all of the questions. Oh, praise Esther. Okay. On that note, thank you so much for coming to my book party. We do have book party favors for all of you who attended. It's going to come on the screen in just a little moment. Dun, 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 dun. Wow, look at that. Buy my book if you haven't already. I hope this sold it for you. Just as a note, if you did purchase the book not through SCM Press and you're waiting for it because you bought it through, say, Amazon or another bookseller, or if you're waiting for the ebook, do not fear, it's coming soon. Do not fear, it's happening. All of which to say, once more, thank you to everybody who came. Super duper thank you to Sarah, Esther, and Catherine for their time and their energy here. And also thank you to the gracious hosts today of our time, my publisher, SCM Press. You are all, you three are highly cited in the book. So obviously you are all part of why this book is even here. So on that note, be well. Thank you.